boldly taken by the entire crew of the Department of English in this institution to conduct a discussion, a healthy discussion on one of the most prolific thinkers of all time, Friedrich Nietzsche. When Srijamam first informed me of the topic of this seminar, which carries an interesting title too, Thus Spake Nietzsche, I must admit that I was a little bit surprised. Why Nietzsche? A plethora of literary figures are there, and a phalanx of literary topics are there. Still, why Nietzsche? I think I have found an answer, almost found an answer early this morning. You know, it happened like this. Yesterday I read an article in Madhubhumi or somewhere regarding the increase in the number of people who use mobile phones, especially people who carry mobile phones to bathrooms. So early this morning I decided to keep my phone away, thinking on the dismay, disintegration and chaos that has been bestowed upon the European civilization as thought by Friedrich Nietzsche. And I almost closed my door, which had only one handle from one side. So technically I was actually found myself locked inside the room. And at first, just like Nietzsche was claiming in one of his works, one of his later works, that I am the last person, I am the loneliest person in the entire Europe. I also thought that I am the loneliest person in the entire Angamali, entire Ernakulam. And then I thought, if, as Nietzsche says, if something which cannot kill you, that will make you stronger. So I began to analyze the genealogy of the locks, the history of the locks, and whether can I unlock the lock. And then I decided that yes, God is dead. But somehow I found a man on the road. He was actually either scandal mongering or discussing some politics. I succumbed to his slave morality. And his morality actually saved me from locking in the forever. Somehow I fervently hope that this may not have an eternal recurrence, these types of incidents. Anyway, keeping the analogies and anecdotes apart, I would say this question still is very valid. Why Nietzsche? Nietzsche has been the subject of fervent interpretation by individuals representing a wide spectrum of contrasting and diversive ideologies. This eclectic range includes anarchists, feminists, post-feminists, Nazis, religious sects, socialists, Marxists, neo-Marxists, vegetarians, avant-garde artists, proponents of physical culture, and staunch conservatives like the fascists and so on. The list goes on. I would say hardly any prominent German cultural or artistic personality over the past 9 decades has refrained from recognizing Nietzsche's influence and his impact, ranging figures ranging from Thomas Mann to Sigmund Freud to Carl Gustav Jung to Heidegger, Foucault, Deleuze, and Derrida. Even Freud was once he said, it was recorded, that Freud stopped reading Foucault in fear of that almost all his ideas, which are still in its budding stage, was already been anticipated in Nietzsche's work. That's why he stopped reading Nietzsche. Anyway, Nietzsche's ideas have experienced, some kind of successive surges of influence too. Although there were times when he fell into obscurity, or rather thrown into mere oblivion due to his association with what they say, German militarism, leading to some kind of a vilified image of the philosopher by the Allied forces, especially early in the first few decades of the 20th century. And it is in the early years of the same, I mean the 20th century, he was extensively, and it should be noted, extensively and often inaccurately translated into English and other languages. So these mistranslations also carry the responsibility of reading Nietzsche from an antagonistic point of view. Subsequently, during a period when Nietzsche's reputation had hit its lowest ebb in both England and United States, I would say, it is actually Walter Kaufmann. Yes, Walter Kaufmann embarked on a project to retranslate many of Nietzsche's essential works. And this undertaking had a profound impact on reshaping the perception on Nietzsche. And it is actually Kaufmann's Nietzsche that we right now discuss on. Kaufmann actually portrayed Nietzsche as a philosopher with a more conventional approach compared to the one who had been previously inspiring movements like anarchism and Nazism and so on. As a result, Nietzsche emerged as a rational and reasonable thinker. It was his, Kaufmann's primary objective to firmly establish Nietzsche's detachment from Nazis, as well as from any rationalist movements that had claimed him as their intellectual precursors. And history says it is the chief responsible person behind this is Nietzsche's own sister, who was a staunch fascist. So it became increasingly challenging to understand the controversies that had once surrounded Nietzsche. This actually marked the commencement of what you can say the academicization of Nietzsche. As he's now regarded as a philosopher to be analyzed, to be compared and contrasted with luminaries of the world of thought such as Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, and other leading figures of the Western philosophical canon. In Europe, in fact, Nietzsche was never fallen out of favor, especially after World War II. He captured the attention of existentialists and phenomenologists. Moreover, during 1960s and 70s, he emerged as a focal point for critical theories, post-structuralists and deconstructionists. And as these movements gained prominence in the United States, subsequently, Nietzsche once again became recognized as their primary source of inspiration. And this particular dynamic has actually led into a thriving Nietzschean industry with a number of books published on him, likely surpassing those on any other philosophers. Nietzsche's broad appeal across diverse schools of thought and counter-thought is actually undoubtedly responsible for this phenomenon. Nonetheless, the diverse range of interpretation of his writings, instead of diminishing over the years, I would say, appears to be expanding, albeit in less extreme forms than in the past. Over the course of the 16 years during which he penned his mature work, starting from The Birth of Tragedy and onwards, Nietzsche was advancing his viewpoints at an unprecedented pace, with little regard for explicitly indicating when his perspective evolved. I would like to quote Michael Tanner, who is the author of a very short introduction on Nietzsche. He says, I quote, what he more often did was to try to see his earlier works in a new light, surviving his career in a way that suggests he thought one could not understand his later writings without a knowledge of his previous ones, to see how he had advanced and thus taking himself to be exemplary of how modern man, immured in the decaying culture of the 19th century, might move from acquiescence in it to rebellion and suggestions for radical transformation. So what I am planning here is to find out a peculiar connection in Nietzschean thought, as it has been unraveled in one of his less discussed works titled On the Use and Abuse of History for Life, which is actually a part of his untimely meditations. This particular essay is relatively more approachable in terms of readability, yet it proves to be exceptionally challenging to fully grasp. This complexity actually arises from the fact that Nietzsche composed it not primarily as a contemplation on history itself, but rather as a deliberate declaration against a very specific target, the culture in the German Empire, which was excessively fixated on history. We can relate this. Initially, Nietzsche intended on the use and abuse, or rather you can say disadvantages of history for life, to be part of a larger project consisting of 13 essays, each exploring a distinct facet of Imperial Germany. However, this undertaking lost its momentum, leading Nietzsche to publish only 4 essays from the collection, eventually grouped under the title Untimely Meditations in 1873. It was also the time when Nietzsche actually published his first work, the Birth of Tragedy, which suffered some kind of academic criticism, sheer academic criticism. So he was a little bit disgusted with this particular drawback. So he wanted to prove that, especially the major criticism raised upon this Birth of Tragedy was it lacks historical sense, or what they call the historical science. So Nietzsche wanted to prove that historical sense can also be analyzed philosophically. So, in this particular essay, he asked his readers to consider cows, how they exist in an eternal present, unspoiled by anxiety over the future or memory of the past. Like children, they have no history, and for that they would be grateful if they knew what history was. But, Nietzsche goes on to say that man does have a history and awareness that he stands at the end of a vast chain of consequence, I quote, which has produced him how he does not know and is taking him where he cannot say, and with this knowledge, he has a burden that needs to be overcome, end quote. Nietzsche actually differentiated 3 types of history in this particular essay. The first one being monumental history, second one antiquarian history, and the final one critical history. Monumental history, if you analyze, it actually is in its pursuit actually seeks inspiration from the past, looking for models, especially figures, to hold in high regard. While this approach suggests the potential for emulation or even a fascination of attempting to surpass past greatness, it frequently devolves into a simplistic form of what we call hero worship. Simply speaking, it's hero worship. It avoids the challenges and demands of the present by seeking refuge in the imagined company of illustrious figures from the past. And also it instills a sense of hope that such greatness might still be attainable in the contemporary world, often fueled by an underlying fleeting faith in humanity. Nevertheless, its ultimate impact tends to drain the admirer rather than invigorate them. It also is the kind that uses the past to inspire us to attempt great things. Popular histories like that we go through during our academic years, like French Revolution or American Revolution or the Indian independence struggle, and all those great figures are actually constituting these types of history. The great men of the past are actually held up for our admiration, and we learn by vicariously participating in their struggles, doubts, and triumphs how to live our own lives. So we actually model them in order to live our present. We take heart from, I thought, the knowledge that the great which once existed was at least possible once and may well again be possible sometime. However, monumental history has its drawbacks. By focusing on a grand scale on the so-called heroic, it obscures the mundane and the ignoble. This actually anticipates the discursive formation of Foucault. I can give you an example. Next one. I think we are familiar with the discourse of gynecology, right? Gynecology. And, there are several hospitals which have this particular section, this department of gynecology, and people are used to it. People no more bother about going there or getting admitted there. It's a smooth process, right? And it helps a lot of women to have what you can say is smooth. It actually smoothens a part of their life. But when we analyze this particular, the history of this particular discourse, we may be baffled. We will be a little bit flabbergasted. This photo is of Sir James Marion Sims, who is known as the father of gynecology. And, he was an American physician, very renowned for his surgical work, especially in the field of the repair of vesico-vaginal fistula, which is a severe complication of obstructed childbirth. Last year, interestingly, in America, in many of the towns of America, the monuments erected, actually commemorating his service, was being demolished by the authorities themselves. There is a reason behind that. If you analyze this particular hero of the past, and if you analyze how the so-called discursive formations have been taking place upon a particular field, we will get the picture of this James Marion Sims as a cruel man who is ruthlessly conducting operations, surgeries on Negro women. There is a description of how Sims ended up. He was one of the most famous and venerated, physicians in the country. Occasionally, Sims conducted experimental surgery on white women, but his main subjects were 12 enslaved black women with fistulas, who he treated at his own expense in his backyard hospital. And there was also a popular assumption during those days that black women do not feel pain. So he treated them without giving them sufficient anesthesia and stuff. So, the present day gynecology, the present day discourse is actually the result of some brutal experiments conducted upon black women. Especially, there are three main black women are there. Next. They are Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy. These are the only names available which he mentions in his academic journal, in his medical journal. We don't know whether these names are their actual names. Anyway, right now, monuments of them have been erected, calling them the mothers of gynecology. So gynecology, as we know, is some kind of a department which functions smoothly, is actually a result of the so-called brutal history of conducting surgeries upon people who are otherwise, who cannot raise their voice, or who are rather sidelined and marginalized. So this is what the problem of what Nietzsche says, the monumental history, hero worshipping, worshipping idols from the past, thinking that they have certain kind of importance in the present too. That won't work. The second one is antiquarian history. Antiquarian history is a contrasting endeavor carried out by a devout collector of historical knowledge as artifacts. It pays tribute to the past solely based on the virtue of its age. Antiquarian history always possesses an extremely restricted field of vision, and the little it does sees much too close up and isolated, making it incapable of drawing meaningful connections among the specimen it has actually hoarded. Unlike the monumentalist, the antiquarian is happy with the commonplace, but thinks everything old is equally worthy of reverence. So he basically functions on artifacts that he collects from the past. It may not be the literal artifacts, but every type of knowledge that he collects from the past serves for his purpose. And therefore, he has no sense of proportion, says Nietzsche. Antiquarian history is history for its own sake, the view that we study the past, not because it will do anything for us, but simply because we find it pleasurable to inhabit a kind of what he calls the lost world, which nevertheless lives on through us. An example can be cited from the American history. There is a town, a settlement, which is called Colonial Williamsburg. Colonial Williamsburg, it's actually a town built for no other purpose than to serve as a living relic of the life of mid-18th century America, and which is meant to bring Americans into a closer awareness of their past, simply because it is their past. This is the exact point in which we are, so fond of the so-called Nalagatta and, such Nadumuttam and all other architectural stuff. We are actually going back in order to recreate the past, just for the sake of the past. So, any attempt to study the past from a point in the past is actually something which is called archaeology by Foucault. This actually anticipates the archaeology of Foucault. One advantage of the antiquarian history is that it fosters, especially on tradition, and teaches people to love their home and their country. Its danger is that it tempts people to venerate anything old as good in and of itself, and can foster a narrow-minded suspicion about anything new, foreign or different. Then history becomes a dead hand of the past, crushing the life that history is supposed to serve. Then, Nietzsche says, you may well witness the repugnant spectacle of a blind lust for collecting, of a restless raking together of all that has once been. And, last in Nietzsche's typology of history is critical history. If he is to live, this is what Nietzsche says, I quote, man must possess and employ the strength to break up and dissolve a part of the past by bringing it before the tribunal, scrupulously examining it and finally condemning it. Scrupulously examining it and finally condemning it. A critical analysis of history holds out the promise of it's promise that one might root out the deficiencies of our inborn heritage, as he says, and implant in ourselves a new habit, a new instinct, a second nature, so that the first nature withers away. However, Nietzsche produces to content that the inclination toward critical history is motivated by a zeal for the condemnation of disguised as fair and unbiased justice. Critical history is more typical of scholarship than popular history or museum history. It engages with the past in order to interrogate it and to see what in the past is worthy of continuation in the present and what should be discarded as mere relic or worse, an encumbrance. See, an instance can be cited. I have a friend in Jaipur. See, we would talk for hours about literature and the stuff. And one day I was mentioning her about the, construction of metro here in Kochi. And there was a news in the newspapers that authorities were giving jobs to transgender people, 100 transgender people or something like that. I actually mentioned this to this friend, and all of a sudden she said, what are you talking about? Why are you giving jobs to these transgender people? They are actually horrible. They cannot be tolerated within our social spectrum. And likewise, I was actually wondering why people have so much disgust towards these marginalized gender. If you analyze or if you analyze the history of them, in a critical manner, like the way Nietzsche says, the critical history of them, you can see once they were respected in almost all the spectrum of life. You can have plenty of examples. Right from our epics, Mahabharata, you see, there is this character called Shikhanti. Shikhanti was actually a king. It's not the title of a particular gender, it's a person, right? Shikhanti ja Maharatha, that's what Bhagavad Gita says. Shikhanti was a great warrior. There are plenty of other examples can be cited from the same epic. We have Chitrangada, right? We have Iravan. In Tamil Nadu, I heard that there is a festival, a 14-day festival have been conducting upon the name of Iravan. There is the story of Mohini. And coming to the Mughal dynasty, we have plenty of examples. There were ministers in Akbar's cabinet who were actually hijras. There were also hijras who could be found as the keepers of the harems. So, and people firmly believed that the water which has been touched by them carries some kind of a divine quality. So, all these ages in India, these transgender people were well respected. They were given, positions in executive system and the stuff. But what happens, after the 1857 war, the first independence war, while the British, they invaded Delhi, and when they witnessed, there were number of hijras, number of transgender people were there in the palace of Bahadur Shah Zafar II. They were actually astonished because in their practice, any type of differently oriented sexual people are actually criminals. They are inborn, what you call inborn sinners. So in 1861, they actually issued a law which is called the the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. And in this particular act, it was actually primarily directed to tribal communities. It also gave, limiting the rights of transgenders and gender non-conforming individuals and communities in India. Especially hijras were targeted under this particular act. The Criminal Tribes Act of 1871 created the category of what we call eunuchs to refer to the many, often unrelated, gender non-conforming communities in India, including hijras and kotis. Colonial authorities claimed that it was necessary for eunuchs to be registered under the act to prevent them from kidnapping children and or engaging in sodomy. In reality, there was little official evidence of any gender non-conforming communities in India kidnapping children, or of many children living in gender non-conforming communities. And the Criminal Tribes Act actually banned all behavior considered suspicious, warning that anyone found engaging in traditional hijada activities like public dancing or dressing in women's cloth would be arrested or shot to death. So it actually gave a legal right to a person to kill hijadas, or so-called people who belong to these transgender communities at sight. They will be shot at sight. So what happened, during the advent of 20th century, the early decades of 20th century, these people, these transgender people who were once revered by the Indian community, the entire Indian community, they confined themselves into the outskirts of mainstream lives. Some of them became robbers, some of them became prostitutes, and many of them actually thrown into oblivion. And what happens, in the 21st century, we view them with contempt, and we have a pejorative attitude towards them. So this is how history is being constructed. This is what Foucault calls, Nietzsche calls critical history. Nietzsche felt that these types of history had completely overpowered the others, the other two. And the people were simply too enamored of the facts for their own good. By puncturing the myths of monumental and antiquarian history, critical history actually destroyed everything that we intuitively identify within the past and its ability to impart meaning to our lives. This is how we construct our present, by keeping ourselves away from the past and forming new constructs every day. It will be better to live in an eternal moment of what Nietzsche calls bovine carelessness, or the carelessness of an innocent child. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This is how he puts it. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The past is never dead. It's not even past. So we beat on, boards against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. The angel of history, his face turned toward the past, is propelled into the future by a storm we call progress. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. When any of these forms of historical awareness becomes excessive, this is how he warns us. Any of these forms become excessive, they ultimately harm the individual, either by making them feel left behind compared to the past, or by empowering them to pass judgment upon it. Nietzsche says we need history, certainly we need history. But for the sake of life and action, we want to serve history only to the extent that history serves life. And, the urgency in Nietzsche's essay, here in this beautiful essay, arises from his dissatisfaction with what he perceived as a cultural crisis engulfing the emerging German nation state shortly after the Franco-Prussian War. Germans, unlike the other parts of Europe, felt a pressing need to establish robust cultural foundations to support their intellectual tradition of historicism, using it to reframe, often to grandiose terms, the characteristics, geographical conditions, past leaders, heroes, and modes of artistic expressions to uphold what they call the German spirit. So this is exactly what happens when too much of the past is being served for the purpose of creating the present. So Nietzsche says that there must be a kind of balance in between these three elements: monumental, antiquarian, and what he calls the critical history. See, ultimately, Nietzsche's most significant observation regarding this particular essay, I mean, the use and disadvantages of history for life, is something, it's a kind of cliche right now. Specifically, the history is exclusively a human, profoundly a human endeavor. It doesn't consist of the unadulterated remnants of the past. Rather, it is the link we endeavor to establish with the past. So Nietzsche contributed to illustrating that nothing in history actually unfolds by natural or predetermined means. Therefore, it is not inevitable that those who fail to recollect the past will be condemned to relive it. So this is the Nietzsche who adopted the practice of genealogically reconstructing how a variety of cherished moral convictions and intellectual principles, often presumed to be timeless absolutes, were in reality products of a particular time and locale. It is to this Nietzsche that Foucault's genealogy is actually indebted. This is where we can find a particular connection between Nietzsche and Foucault. Foucault's unfathomable influence on the post-structuralist, or rather post-modernist thought, have actually paved the way to approach history from a new perspective. Often considered to be the precursor of the new historicism method, Foucault's influential concepts had a tremendous impact upon post-structuralists, postmodernists, LGBT theorists, feminists, and so on. He terms his early historical analysis as archaeology, which probes the possibilities of non-visible formation of culture which regulates practices and representations. He actually investigates the hidden structures of structures beneath a particular culture. In order of things, Foucault actually introduces the concept of episteme, a conglomeration of a set of relations that govern the discursive practices of the prevalent day. He analyzes how these particular epistemes compose the particular history of an epoch. This idea is well reflected in Madness and Civilization, in which he analyzes how normality, or rather abnormality, has evolved as a discourse in the Western culture. To cite an example from literature, we can say, you might remember the opening scene of Macbeth, right? In Macbeth, we have three witches. They appear before the characters Banquo and Macbeth, right? And they say fair is foul and foul is fair and all the stuff related to that. But do you think that this is just a coincidence, or rather it is the result of the supreme genius of Shakespeare, who introduced this particular supernatural element in order to add more hue to his artistic creations? Is it just Shakespeare's invention? No, we cannot say that. If we analyze the history of Elizabethan England or the so-called Jacobean England, you can easily find out instances from other works. This is how new historicism works, right? To find a context and also a context. If you go for some texts like Demonology, Demonology is written by none other than James I himself, which actually gives some kind of admonition to his subjects to be aware of demons and ghosts and goblins and the stuff. So when you go through Demonology, there are several chapters. You can find several chapters which are dedicated to witches, and how witches have been, you can see they have been depicted in black gowns and with a hood and the stuff. It also, several critics say that it also has some kind of other history starting right from the medieval times, especially related to the production of ales, wine. Early in the 13th and 14th century, the production of ale or wine was actually a domestic activity conducted by so many, conducted by women, mainly women. But what happens, in 16th century, especially after the establishment of East India Company and the stuff, the production of wine was shot into some kind of industrial scale. So what happens, these companies who produce ale or wine should have to prohibit these women, the domestic production of ale. So the best idea for them, women were usually those women who run, the inns in which these ales and wines and cakes were served. They would usually appear in the same black gown with a hood and with a broom. And if you go through the pictures of witches, especially in 17th and 18th century, you can see them traveling on a broom with black hood, with black gown and stuff. So transferring this particular image of domesticated ale producers into witches are easily an easy way for these industrial scale producers of wine. So this is how it becomes a part of the so-called genealogical, or rather you can say archaeological evidence. So I would say this particular scene in which the three witches all of a sudden appear in Macbeth is not a coincidence. Witches were so common in Shakespeare's times. Witches were tried, they were crucified, they were burnt alive, and the stuff. So, the same is being mentioned in Shakespeare and Exorcism by Stephen Greenblatt, one of the interesting essays. Anyway, history is not evolved as something which has a linear movement, but rather shattered and disoriented pieces of epistemic foundation. This is how Foucault mentions it. The treatment of history as something which is called regimes of practice, rather than a smoothly evolved holistic corpus, is central to Foucauldian analysis. The history of ideas present material conditions, a continuous flow of movements of thought from top to bottom, which deliberately or not effaces those unheard voices and unrecorded annals. It always demands continuity and never entertain ruptures. So this is how we perceive history, a history of flow, a history of relentless flow without having any ruptures. On the contrary, following or taking cues from Nietzsche's critical history, which he later developed as genealogy, in Genealogy of Morals, especially when he analyzes how envy or resentment, the history of envy and resentment among Christianity, Christian values, how they have been originated and the stuff. Taking cues from these ideas, Foucault's regime of practice never advocates any type of injecting or projecting meaning into history. All we have are material effects and material acts. There is no essential meaning to things, no essential subject behind action, nor is here an essential order to history. Rather, order is the writing of history itself. This is why they say the textuality of history and historicity of the text. Stephen Greenblatt and Dallimore and so on. This paradigm shift from analyzing history from a structuralist point of view through archaeology to a more sophisticated method of viewing it as ruptured corpus of discontinuities is a dominant practice on Foucault, especially in his later works such as which he calls genealogy. Genealogy is the history written in light of current concerns. Genealogy is the history written in accordance with the commitment to the issues of the present moment, and such it intervenes in the present moment. Genealogy, in short, is effective history, as Nietzsche would put it, written as a current intervention. So this is the same idea is being propounded by Slavoj Žižek, one of the most formidable figures of present philosophical world. What he calls short-circuiting. in one of his seminal works published in 2006, namely The Parallax View. He uses short-circuiting as a metaphor for his way of reading. A text is actually a network of signifiers, of words, through which a relentless, a continuous flow of meaning takes place. Short-circuiting or critical reading disrupts its normal flow. At its core, the idea of parallax, this is what he calls parallax. Parallax actually refers to the shift that occurs when viewing an object or situation from different angles. Zizek employs this idea metaphorically to analyze various philosophical, political, and cultural phenomena. According to Zizek, the parallax view actually enables us to uncover the inherent contradictions and gaps that exist within our understanding of reality. See, this is how parallax works. See, the central object, parallax is actually a shifting of perspective from the part of the subject rather than the object. Object remains to be the same and viewpoint actually shifts, which eventually results in different perspectives. Okay, next one, please. 3 fingers, right? This is easy to examine. When we place our finger like this and view it with one eye shut, the finger is on one particular point. And with the other eye shut, it proves, it will move to other direction. But in fact, the object remains to be the same. Only the perception changes, right? This is the kind of idea. This is what is short-circuiting. And, when I go through some of his works like the ticklish subject or tarrying with the negative, freight of real tears and parallax view itself, Nietzsche is much more of a Hegelian or rather a Kantian rather than a Nietzschean. In many of his works, he actually records his dissenting voice on Nietzsche, especially the idea of resentment. He says that, I can say Hegel actually represents the absolute values in European philosophical corpus, and the conceptual matrix of Zizek actually dealing with this particular value. And Nietzsche, on the contrary, he was actually against all those moral values, all values in fact. In the philosophical context, the parallax can be seen as the tension between two different points of view, where neither can be reduced to the other. And this tension arises due to the fundamental gap that exists between how we perceive reality and how reality actually is. Zizek argues that this gap is essentially for generating critical insights and questioning established norms and ideologies. This is in fact nothing but genealogy, or what Nietzsche calls effective or creative history itself. What Nietzsche actually argues that there must be a balance. Excess of critical historical perspective may damage our present. This is what Nietzsche says. And this is where we can find a possible connection between these 3 different figures, Nietzsche, Foucault, and Zizek. See, in politics, actually Zizek suggests that parallax can enable us to identify the contradiction between the ideological appearances presented by various political discourses. And in culture and ideology, he argues that parallax permits us to discern the gap between the symbolic order and its underlying antagonisms. Overall, the concept of parallax is employed by Zizek as a tool for critical analysis and revealing the inconsistencies and gaps within our perspectives on reality, philosophy, politics, and culture. A best example can be cited from Alain Badiou. Badiou actually describes the instance of a dedicated professor, a pious young professor actually lecturing in a class. If my memory serves me better, quite unexpectedly, he notices a beautiful, dreamy girl, like, Tennyson's Rosalind. This is how he goes on among the students, fixing her bright eyes on him. instantaneously, he feels thrown out of his being. This particular alluring gaze interrupts the smooth running of the lecture. This is an event, as this is what Badiou calls an event, disrupting the very subjectivity of the professor. The alluring gaze is actually an example of what Lacan calls la pettia, or the small other. Why does the small other so forcefully attract the professor? Because his desire for something, what he calls libidinal. Zizek called this as something which is called the object cause of desire. And the parallax view, viewing this particular instance through the lens of parallax, we can see the bright eyes event. The girl was just a student, an object of his lecturing. Right? Initially, the girl is actually just a student. She is actually the object of the professor's lecture. But at the occurrence of the event, so-called event, there happens what Zizek calls a transubstantiation. Transubstantiation is actually a Hegelian notion. It's something which has been a tradition in Christian Eucharist ceremony, where the bread and wine is being actually taken as the flesh and blood of Jesus Christ. So one thing actually stands for another. This is what is called transubstantiation. And there is a transubstantiation takes place. All of a sudden the subject, the professor who's been teaching, who's been lecturing, and the object is the student. When this particular event takes place, there is a shift in the subject-object position. I think you get it, right? There is a shift in the subject-object position. Earlier, the student, the object was actually subjected to the gaze of the professor, but all of a sudden, after the event, the professor becomes subjected to the alluring gaze of the object. You get it? So there is a shift in the subject-object position. This is what is called transubstantiation. And the two ways of girl's appearance to the professor is an example of what we call parallax view. And the causal event, the alluring gaze in this case is called parallax shift. This particular idea can also be analyzed through the perspective of our indigenous history. Right? I think cricket, right now World Cup is going on. Cricket is being perceived as, right now, the most flamboyant game of India. It has a history, a genealogical history, or rather, there is a parallax gap, or what Foucault calls creative history behind cricket. Exactly where did the first cricket club was established in India? Are you sure? Are you sure? The first cricket club in India? This is the problem with the so-called history, our sense of history. We think that since Mumbai produces the larger number of cricketers, it's been in Mumbai. It might be in Mumbai. In fact, it is in Tellicherry, in Talacheri, in Kerala. You might be wondering, right? It is none other than Sir Arthur Wellesley, who had been fighting Padashiraja, right? And continuously suffering from a lot of setbacks because of the guerrilla warfare and the stuff, who went to the Waterloo and won over Napoleon. The same person, Sir Arthur Wellesley, who established the first cricket club in Tellicherry, right? And when we analyze the history of cricket in India, we might be right. In Mumbai as well as in several other northern parts of India, cricket was usually played by the Maharajas and the upper caste, and this is well evident in Lagan, right? In Lagan, we can see this. But in Tellicherry, there is a parallax. When you analyze the history of Tellicherry, yes, this is a scoreboard. This is a scoreboard of 1860s. The players who played cricket against some of the renowned English players who actually participated in Ashes Test series and the stuff during the 1860s and 1870s and 1890s. There were people. If you analyze the scoreboard, you can see there were people from almost all the vagues of social life. There were Dobbies, there were Muslims, who were otherwise not at all invited to play such games. There were Christians who were known as Vellatiyas. Actually the the offsprings of the mistresses of the white men. Then there were there were Tiyas who were otherwise considered to be a marginalized caste back then. In fact, you cannot see the so-called Nayars and Nambudiris in this particular scoreboard. Why? Because Nayars and Nambudiris of the erstwhile Tellicherry were supposed to study. They were not at all participating in games like this. But for these people who are otherwise marginalized, they actually actively participated in games, not because of the kind of intoxication, or rather the pleasure you get from participating in a game, but to gain social momentum. Right? This is what is the parallax, as Zizek mentions it. During the British colonial era, in the Malabar coast, Tellicherry was a key hub for trades and the stuff. See, to the British colonial rulers, cricket was a means of asserting cultural dominance and reinforcing their colonial agenda. For the local population, engaging with cricket was often a kind of attempt to negotiate their place within the colonial power structure while preserving their own traditions. This disparity of perspective actually creates a parallax gap that exposes the complexity of this particular town's colonial past. See? While Nietzsche and Foucault actually attempts a critical approach to history and propound, or rather they postulate what they call genealogy, Zizek, through his idea of short-circuiting, attempts to find parallax gaps. I engage Zizek in this discussion because he's more of a Hegelian, as I have already mentioned, than of a Nietzschean, and he encapsulates this, those values which were already dismantled by Nietzsche. What we need a kind of reconciliation between these, among these three great figures. Now, how this become possible? I'll sum up with an example. I think you might have come across this particular text, Hayavadana by Girish Karnad, right? Girish Karnad. Karnad actually radically experiment with the original plot of Hayavadana, right? If you go through the text, it's very easy. The original story of Hayavadana is actually taken from Vedala Panjavimshika, right? Vedala Panjavimshika, a collection of some 25 tales within a frame story written in Sanskrit of anonymous authorship. One of the oldest recensions is found in Kathasarit Sagara, which is titled as Vedala Panjavimshadi, and Sir Richard Francis Burton attempted a free adaptation of the stories in 1870. The main narrative of these stories is that a demon called Vedala posits some cryptic riddles before the valiant warrior king Vikramaditya. If he fails to answer the riddle, his head will be shattered into pieces. The 9th story of the 25 stories, the 9th story proposes the most famous riddle. The head or the rest of the body, which one is more significant? This is the question. Vedala narrates the king the story of two bosom friends, Gunagara and Devasharma. the latter, I mean, Deva Sharma marries a girl called Unmadini, a very beautiful lady, and he he actually vouches if he ever able to marry this particular beautiful lady, he would offer his head to goddess Kali. As it turns out, he beheads himself, and seeing the plights of his friend, what happens, Gunagara, he's actually being too loyal. He also beheads himself. Seeing this, Unmadini, she wants to commit suicide. All of a sudden, what happens, goddess Kali appears before them, and she grants them some boons. What they say, Unmadini, on the verge of killing herself, is rescued by the goddess, and she gives her a blessing to restore life into the demised beloveds. And in that chaotic moment of utter bafflement, she actually misplaces the heads into one another's body. I mean, Gunagara's head into Deva Sharma's body. Now Vetala asks this fundamental question: whom should Unmadini take as her husband? The king answers that she should go with one who has the head of her husband. It affirms the supremacy of head, right, in subject formation, identity and subjectivity. Subjectivity, identity and everything which relates to this particular is actually related to head. It affirms what the concept in almost all Indian philosophical scriptures, which is called Uttamanga. Head is called Uttamanga, the most significant organ. But Carnot actually bases his adaptation on the transposed heads by Thomas Benn, who is an ardent Nietzschean. Keep in mind that. He actually represents the story in a different perspective in Hayavadana, right? Hayavadana, we have this Gunagara and Deva Sharma has been transformed into Kapila and Devadatta. Kapila is actually the son of a locksmith. Devadatta is a Brahmin, right? Then, the plot goes on the same way. Devadatta actually vows, I swear if I ever get her as my wife, I will sacrifice my 2 arms to the goddess Kali, I will sacrifice my head to Lord Rudra, and it goes on like that. With Kapila's help, here Unmadini is being changed into Padmini. With Kapila's help, he marries Padmini, and Padmini actually gradually falls in love with Kapila's body. Right? Kapila's body, she's so fervent about Devadatta's intellectual stuff, intellectual faculty and the stuff. But she actually falls in love with Kapila's body. Kapila also reciprocates her love with great caring and willing to do anything, any kind of adventure to please her. This is what happens, the story goes on like in the original one, and everyone kills, the Devadatta and Kapila kill themselves. Padmini tries to place the heads upon their bodies, and here she deliberately misplaces it because she actually falls in love with Kapila's body. She wants a person with the head of Devadatta, who is highly intellectual, and the body, so muscular one of that of Kapila. So she deliberately misplaces it. So what happens, in the due course, Devadatta is actually happy with Kapila's body, and when Kapila reacts to this particular misplacing, deliberate misplacing, Devadatta actually quotes from the Shastras. According to the Shastras, head is the sign of a man. They argue violently, and again the Shastras are being quoted. Of all Kapila never agrees with this, though Padmini describes Kapila and discards Kapila and his the so-called new body. After a few days, what happens? Devadatta, remember, he is a Brahmin. He lives with his so-called head. His body begins to decline, and it comes back to its former position. But Kapila, due to his hard work, he again tries to build up his muscle. He tries to jack himself up. And what happens, in the climax, we can see there is a duel between these two, and Padmini also kills herself. This is how it goes on. Anyway, the play can be analyzed as a specimen of the existential crisis and identity politics, even though a genealogical, Nietzsche says, an effective historical analysis can also be made, or rather we can short-circuit it. Here we have to deal with two problems. The first one is that, does the head stand as mere metonymic or metaphoric symbol for authority? The second one, does Carnot's treatment of this myth actually upsets or usurps the already known politics of the supremacy of head over body? This is the exact point in which we have to determine what kind of history that we have to trace. The notion of the supremacy of head, keep in mind, over the body, is so ancient discourse. It can be traced back to the Vedic discourse. Many Sanskrit texts, including the Amarakosha. Amarakosha is actually the illustrious lexicon of Sanskrit written by Amarasimha, and Ayurvedic texts like the Ashtanga Hridaya, Susruta Samhita. All these texts actually use the same terminology, Uttamanga for head. In Amarakosha we have Uttamangam Shiras Shirsham Murdhno Mastagostriyam. This is how Uttamanga is being mentioned in Amarakosha. This is as old as the so-called Chadurvarnya system which prevailed in India. Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra are the four categories of Chadurvarnya system, in which the first three are actually decorating the top three ladders, social ladder, whereas the Shudras are considered to be outcasts and untouchables. Ancient record of this classification can be found in the 10th mandala of Rigveda, which is called Purusha Sukta, where the universe, the cosmos, is being considered to be the body of Purusha. The previous one. Okay, this is it. The body of, this is what is called Virat Purusha, or the cosmic being, in which we have this particular sloga, Brahmanosya Mukham Asid, Bahu Rajanya Krita, Uru Tadasya Yad Vaishya, Padbhyam Shudro Ajayata. This is how it goes on. Right? The Brahmin is the head of the Purusha, since head is considered to be the Uttamanga, the noble, supreme organ. It constitutes the supremacy of Brahmins as the head of not the cosmic body, but the social body of India. Right? So right from the beginning, I always wonder why the term Brahmin is being used in different senses. It's the same sense the term Arya is being used in Rigveda. Arya Sarva Samasheva Sadaiva Priyadarshana. This is how Rigveda addresses Aryans. Arya is a person who finds beauty, who finds, who offers compassion to everybody. This is how it goes on. You can find so many Brahmanas who are not at all Brahmins in the strict sense as we have today. There is one Brahmin who is called Jabala Satyakama in the Upanishads, who is actually an untouchable. There is Ruyaga, right, another untouchable. They were considered to be Brahmins. So Brahmins, actually they held a supreme position. They considered to be the Uttamanga of the Purusha. Then, Kshatriyas, the rulers, are afraid of the power of Brahmins and revered them well. And many such instances can be seen in numerous Hindu texts. Like, in Ramayana itself, we have Vasishta, who is the priest of Raghuvamsha, who orders to kill somebody called Shambhuga, right? This is a well-known story. Rama, without, having second thought, he performs the same. Anyway, here, head or Brahman actually becomes a Foucauldian compositor, what he calls the power or knowledge. Each constitute and regulates each other. Hence, the supremacy attached to head is the same given to the Brahmin as the head of the Varnashrama Dharma system or the class system in India. The cosmic elements evolved out of the body of Purusha. The cosmic elements, it is called Chandrama Manaso Jata, Shaksho Suryo Ajayana. Mukhad indrascha agnischa pranad vayu rajayana. It goes on like the moon was actually originated from his mind, and from his eye the sun and Indra and Agni from his mouth were born, Vayu from his breath, the sky was fashioned from his head, whereas earth is formed from the feet, which are, as per the previously mentioned verse, the Shudras. So a random analysis of Indian philosophy, this is not the exact analysis of history that must be done according to genealogy, or according to what we call the parallax gap. We should not stop here. We should also analyze the ruptures in that particular history. How the so-called Varnashrama Dharmam or the Chaturvarna system was practiced in the long history of India. Right? Earlier in Rigveda, it is just the cosmic body has been mentioned. Right? During the 2nd or 1st century BC, we have something which is called Logayada Mada or Charvaga system, in which a different idea of the so-called cosmic being is being practiced. It denies the existence of the soul over the body. It gives prominence to the body. Logayada Mata actually gives prominence to the body. So we have, they say Chaitanya Vishishta Deheva Atma. This particular world is right. This body is right. There is no moksha. This is how they mention it. I am fat, I am lame, I am blind. If the I, the self, were different from the body, this would be meaningless. This is how they say it. And by the time of the supremacy of head, or the so-called Brahmin, was constituted by various discourses such as Manusmriti, which has been considered to be much in vogue during 2nd or 1st century BC, eventually which culminated into the caste system in India. The excellence of Brahmin is asserted by Manusmriti as, I can quote, this is done by Patrick Olivelle. The man is said to be pure above the navel. Therefore, the self-existent one has declared the mouth is the purest part. Because he arouses from the loftiest part of the body, because he is the eldest, and because he retains Veda, the Brahmin is by law and lord of all creation. Among creatures, living beings are the best. Among living beings, those who subsist by intelligence. And among human beings, Brahmins, so the tradition declares. Okay, so Manu asserts that Brahmin is the noble one because he is born from the Uttamanga, head of the supreme being. So this discourse actually goes on and goes on. And what happens, my exact point is, this particular idea of Uttamanga actually finds a rupture in the British colonial India. Especially when, in 1750s, Warren Hastings, after the Plassey War, he ordered somebody called William James to translate some of the most important 50 or 60 texts to English. The first one was being Manusmriti. And, the British colonial officers, however, mistook the Manusmriti as code of law, failed to recognize that it was a commentary on morals and law and not a statement of positive law. The colonial officials of the early 19th century also failed to recognize that Manusmriti was one of many competing Dharma Shastra texts. It was not in use for centuries during the Islamic rule period in India. So Manusmriti thus played a role in constructing the Anglo-Hindu law as well as a Western perception about ancient and medieval era Hindu culture from the colonial times. So keep in mind, when Manusmriti was being translated, it was the first translated by Sir William Jones in 1781, if my memory is right. And the other 52 texts, you have also the Sharia laws. Sharia law, he himself translated it into English for the sake of gathering Indian people under British law. So, had he exactly translated Manusmriti from the original text? Patrick Olivelle says no. He actually translated Manusmriti from a 12th century extremist version, which is called the Kulluga Bhatta version of Manusmriti, which is now in vogue. So all in all, if you come back to the idea of head, in Hayavadana, you can see Devadatta is the head, the man of intellect. He is the son of a revered Brahmin called Vidyasagara, a poet, and he is all about the head. Whereas Kapila, who is actually the son of a locksmith, according to the Varnashrama Dharma system, who is a Shudra, he is all about the body. So this particular gap can be found in these texts. So this is how genealogy and this is how short circuiting should be done. Nietzsche actually tried to give us one particular idea that history never ceases to be. History actually continuously gets reshaped and it has great importance in shaping the present. But too much excessive relying on history will be dangerous. So, having said that, I would say this is the exact idea of short circuiting. This is what genealogy meant by Foucault, and there is the connection in between them. So, that's all about my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your valuable session. It was an insightful one.